Hi, everyone, and thank you for tuning in this week. Welcome to Leap. I am excited for my guest this week, and I am going to read her bio before we leap into her story. So, I would like to introduce Elizabeth Park. She has a Bachelor of Arts in Social and Behavioral Science with a concentration in counseling and a Master of Theology in Pastoral Care and Counseling. In addition, she holds numerous expressive arts facilitating certifications. In the past, she has taught creative movement to children and has had the profound honor to help teens and parents suffering from loss. Currently, she is preparing to do hospital chaplaincy work and is a hospital chaplain intern at Maine Medical Center in Portland. The program grants one CPE unit, and she will be completing that in late April of 2023. Elizabeth is a lifelong learner with innate interpersonal strength. She feels honored to walk alongside those who are in crisis and are navigating grief. Much of that work is accomplished through compassionate listening and reflecting, but often she finds that the expressive arts are particularly helpful as somatically based healing modalities. She gains strength and joy from her faith, and her passions include singing, writing, dancing, improv, acting, and gardening. So, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Susan.
You've done a lot of interesting things in your life that have sort of led you to this point in time. And I had the honor of talking to you before we started recording. And so I know more about your story than sometimes I typically do with our guests. And why I really wanted to have you on the show is because of your own experience with your own unresolved grief with your mom that you lost at a very young age. And so I would love to invite you to start your story of what was happening. You were 19 at the time, I believe. Maybe you could bring us back to that place and time and what was happening in your life and what happened with your mom. And we'll go from there.
Sure thing. I think, especially when you're a teenager, you don't think these sorts of things will happen to you or to your family, that somehow you're invincible. And so I was the age of 17 when I found out that my mom had cancer. And unfortunately, it had metastasized into her bone marrow. So to me, didn't sound like it was a very good thing. And I went through, well, first let me back up and say a little bit that my family was a deeply spiritual family, and they brought me up in Christian faith, which was very strong. And what happened to me when I found out that my mother had cancer was I was surrounded by people who believed, or they had a community of friends that really believed that she was going to be healed. And what they thought that meant was that the cancer would be taken away from her. And I was 17 and I was like, well, yeah, that could happen, but what if it doesn't? And so I ended up actually going on a retreat. It was about this time of the year in the Berkshires. Somebody offered me their cottage, and I got a bunch of books out of the library, and they were all different, studying all different religions. And so I spent that whole week alone and reading about different religions, just really questioning my faith. And, came back, and I was going to a private school at the time, and I met with the headmaster, and I was like, I don't know what to think. I find truth in a lot of these different faith traditions. And he said, truth is truth no matter where it comes from, which kind of gave me the liberty to say, okay, I don't have to buy into, this narrative that my mother was going to be healed. And time went on. She fought the good fight. I guess, we use that language around cancer a lot. The interesting thing is that my mother and I were not particularly close when I was growing up. And I married at the age of 19. And this was in December. And she started to really get sick that following May. So up until that time, she was doing really quite well. But we got close after I got married. And so I was spending a lot of time with her, but I did not know the day that I went to see her that she was in a coma. And my father said, she's doing as best as can be expected. They're feeding her through a straw now. Well, I went up to her bedroom and she was clearly in a coma. And I got scared. And I basically took off, went home, got a call that night that she had died. And her choice was to be cremated. And so they took her away and she was cremated. So that was a pivotal moment where and that was in the very beginning of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's work, and certainly before hospice was a thing. This is 1975. Nobody walked me through saying, you need to spend time, you need to talk to your mother, you need to say goodbye to her. And so that really set me up, not knowing that set me up for, as you call it, unresolved grief in my life. And so, I did fine. I lived my life. I had my children, but there would be times where things would happen. Like I'd see a mother walking across the street with her mother and her child, and it would just grab me, always right in the throat. Like I would just get very emotional about it, and then it would go away. And it was I think it was 1997. So fast forward 42 years later, that something happened. The church that we were going to, the priest who was Episcopal, said he was going to be leaving. He'd been there for 14 years, and he was going to be leaving with his family, moving to Hawaii. And what happened to me at that point in time, I couldn't understand it. I couldn't explain it. I went into this deep, deep grief where I could barely sleep. I could barely eat. I was just very depressed, very sad. And I did not make the connection that this was, this unresolved grief coming up about my mother. And when I did make the connection, this is what happened. My husband said to me, when am I getting my wife back? That made me angry. And that anger turned into just nonstop journaling. And it started with a letter that I wrote to my mother that basically said, what would it have been like if I had stayed with you, if I was with you? What would that have felt like? What would that have been like? Would I have read you a story, or would I have done this, or would I have done that? Just imagining what that could have been. And then what happened is I started writing poetry. And I've always enjoyed writing, simple poetry. It's nothing elaborate. But what would happen is every day a mom poem would come up. And this happened for about a month. And then all of a sudden, I felt different, like something had shifted, and that I somehow felt peace surrounding her death, as if she had heard me writing the poems, that they went from some poem just coming to me intact. I would write it down, and it was as if me writing it in this book, she was hearing it. And then I felt very, very different after that. And, I said, I've got the book right here. I mean, I just have continued writing it, and I finally filled the whole book.
Okay.
Not always mom poems, but yeah.
Okay, so we're gonna slow way down and I love that you just gave us that arc, because now we're gonna delve a little bit more deeply into pieces. That is a beautiful arc of your story. So here you were, young girl, weren't close to your mother, mom gets sick, you don't really know what that means, right? You think she's gonna get healthy, right? Because your mother can't die when you're young, right? Everything's gonna be fine. She slips into a coma, she dies, you don't get any help around it. And we're gonna go into that as well. Many years later, you have a trigger, you feel deep grief. Eventually you start writing, which everybody knows. Everything is about working through it through writing, and you start to feel some relief. So we're going to go there. I want to go back to when you were this young girl and your mother gets sick. Prior to her illness, you said you were not close to your mother, which is really probably not that unusual when we're teenagers and we fight with our mother, right? Because I say it's one thing or your mother instead of one thing or another, right? Like everything leads us back, because I think as women, our mothers, there is no deeper connection than we have with our mothers, whether that's a good connection or a troubled connection.
Sure.
It is what it is. So you were not close to your mother, and you started to get close after her illness. Is that what you said?
It was actually after I got married. So
after you got married
for a couple of years, and after I got married, somehow the dynamic between us changed completely. Yeah.
And how old were you when you got married?
19.
And didn't she die that same year? How long was she sick?
So she was sick for 2.5 years.
Okay.
I was married in December, so she was there for the wedding, and it was wonderful that she was, and able to fully enjoy it. And then she died June 1st. So end of December, June 1st, what is that? 5 months later.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so during this period when you started to feel, do you feel like her illness was a catalyst for you guys to have a different relationship? Or do you feel like that happened naturally because you are now a wife? Is that what you think? So now you were relating woman to woman rather than mother to child. Is that what you think happened?
Yeah, I believe it was primarily from her perspective. I feel like she was able to let go of feeling like she had responsibility in any way for, my decisions, my choices, and who I was. So it was a real gift. That was a real gift to have that. And also, I didn't say I went to boarding school for 3 years. So I was, at the age of 14, I was off at boarding school. So
Okay.
yeah. So, and I had three older brothers. I was daddy's little girl. And so, yeah.
Okay. So you guys started to create this closeness,
Hmm.
but it sounds like when your mom slipped into a coma that you were not in the space of really understanding that your mother was going to die. Is that true? Or did I infer that?
No, I think I knew she was going to die. I think I knew in my head, but I think in my heart, just the physical aspect of her being in a coma and me not knowing what to do with that. It just frightened me. And, there just wasn't any good explanation around what to expect or what was going on. And, it was just, yeah, yeah.
Okay, so what happened when your mother died? What did you do with that? Did you quickly try to move on? I want to know in your young mind and heart how you dealt at the time with your mother's death.
I think I did quickly try to move on. I don't think there was any real processing other than, this memorial service that they had for her, and I couldn't stop crying. But there was not any sort of presence of mind or, saying, oh, listen, you're going through this. You need to allow yourself to grieve. So yes, that's it. The grieving process, I really did not. Now that I know what grieving is, I did not go through that. And I shouldn't put it back onto other people, but I was young, that no one said, you need to let yourself grieve, you need to feel these feelings. So it all gets pushed down,
Yes.
and it has to come out somewhere. How it doesn't, it doesn't just disappear. It's there. Yeah.
Yeah, and what my beautiful, I have a spiritual intuit that I go to, and I love when she said to me one day, you can't, and now I say this to people all the time, you can't think a feeling, you can only feel a feeling. And I think that because we're, that our world is so cerebral, and and this is true for me, that sometimes when we have a feeling, we try to analyze our feeling, right? So we get in our head and you can't think a feeling. And we get so afraid of feeling a feeling, but that is the only way to help dissipate that feeling, is to actually feel it. Emotion is supposed to move through us. So this
Mm-hmm.
idea
Mm-hmm.
of unresolved and stuck grief is a very real thing. It doesn't
Yeah.
have to be death over person either. It can be grief that we feel over the loss of a pet, a job, a divorce, like a dream. It doesn't matter what it is. It's
Exactly.
allowing ourselves to feel it. So here you are, you're married, then you have your own children.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure there were probably multiple times you wished you could have picked up that phone and asked your mother questions throughout the years, right? But let's go back to what triggered where you started to feel grief, that sort of like pulled the lid off Pandora's box.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Let's slow down around the trigger. So bring us back to what happened when all of a sudden you're feeling grief. You didn't connect it to your mother at the time. What happened? What was the poke?
Well, it was funny because I thought it was very strange that so our Episcopal priest, who was really my spiritual director at that time, I went to him, well, confidant, right? There you go. So he was my confidant, and he was just going to up and leave. I'm going to cry. He was just going to up and leave. And so there was this feeling of, something I had no control over, something that felt sort of like abandonment, a death of a kind, that relationship was going to end. And there was really nothing I could do about it. And he did say, so this is, I think, the thing that put it in my mind after he shared with the congregation that he and his family were going to be moving to Hawaii. He did say that sometimes when a minister of a congregation, leaves, it can bring up unresolved grief. So I felt the feeling, and then I made the connection and said, oh, maybe that's what this is. And then I let myself for 2 weeks just shut down. I just
Wow.
shut down. So that was the beginning of 23 years worth of all of those feelings.
I find that a little bit, I want to use the word miraculous, that this departure of this person that had deep meaning to you leaving, I can understand how that would trigger your mother leaving,
Mm-hmm.
right, with no warning, right? These
Right.
these central important people. But what's remarkable to me is that you made that leap with the explanation that sometimes this can trigger old grief, that you somehow made that leap to your mother.
Yeah.
Did it come
Yeah.
to you in a flash of inspiration or an epiphany, or like how did that how
I
did that
can't. I can't remember exactly how it happened, other than it was definitely an aha moment because I was trying to figure out why did this feel so devastating? I mean, it's not like, something horrible happened to him and his family. He was just moving. But it was so devastating to me. But then it made sense when we put the pieces together and said, well, okay, there's something here that needs attention. So
and
yeah.
at that point though, you didn't go seek out a therapist, right? You went inside. You said, I'm going to retreat.
Well, I had actually, I think I mentioned this to you before, that I had actually seen a therapist to get advice on how to, because I knew that there was something going on. This was before the priest left. I knew there was something going on because it would just come up and then it would go away. It would come up, it would go away. And he had suggested something that wasn't particularly helpful, burning pictures and throwing them in the ocean. And, that wasn't helpful. That wasn't what I needed. I think I needed to make this discovery and go through it on my own. And yes, it was through writing. Yeah.
Which,
Yeah.
yeah, which I am such a deep believer in. I hope that you will be willing to share some of your poetry with us. So let's talk about that. So, because I feel like in order for us to allow ourselves to feel, we have to welcome it, right? Because it can be
Mhm.
terrifying to feel those feelings. I mean,
Mhm.
because I know even with clients that I've worked with throughout the years, that if I allow myself to feel, I'm going to start crying and I'm never going to stop. Now, we know, like, we can sit there and we can say, come on now, that's ridiculous. But that is a real fear. That
Mhm.
fear of giving into emotion is a terrifying thing because we feel like it's going to take over, which is really the opposite is true. The tamping down of our feelings is really what zaps our energy. That's really what makes us sick,
Mhm.
whether it's
Mhm.
physical illness, mental illness, whatever it is from stuffing, not releasing,
Exactly.
but it is
Exactly.
still a very real fear. So what
Mhm.
I would love to hear from you is it takes courage to go down this road. It takes courage to do grief work. When you started writing, did you write before that? Because I can hear people, I'm not a writer. I can't tell you how many people say, I'm not a writer. Talk to us about how you allowed yourself to just start writing.
Yeah. Well, I have journaled throughout my life. In high school, I used to love writing fiction, short stories. I've never published, although I've been working on my memoirs for a while now. And one of these days. So I've always enjoyed writing. Writing has actually always been, of the expressive arts modalities, has always been my go-to. Music, of course, too, but now I say, of course, it's just, of course, for me. So no, it wasn't so odd. I wrote poetry, it seemed like every time I would write, it was when I was in some kind of angst, especially in high school, going through the angst you go through just being a teenager. I would write poetry, and in boarding school, we would share our poems with each other, and it was great fun. So yeah, I've always enjoyed writing. So it's not a new thing. So it would make sense that would be, as opposed to drawing, that would be what I would go to, would be to write. And even the work that I've done with people, and I know we could probably talk about this later, I always encourage people to do that, to write letters to the loved person who's gone. Yeah.
I do the same thing. And, you know, and there's anger is a very, and as my spiritual intuit, I interviewed her the other day, and one thing that she said was that when something, an emotion that has been tied to cancer is rage that has had no place to go. And a lot of people can feel intense anger when somebody dies, especially a premature death. I felt I I always say, oh, I'm not an angry person, but when my brother died, I'll never forget. I worked with a spiritual healer, and she told me that the rage would come, and I didn't believe her. And the rage did come, and it wasn't pretty, and it was actually a little terrifying. I mean, I was screaming, I was punching pillows, I was so enraged that my brother died. And sometimes what can accompany rage can also be a deep sense of guilt of what we could have done or should have done or whatever, right?
Oh.
There's people hold all of these emotions around untimely death, or it doesn't even have to be untimely. You can be your 95-year-old mother. And so writing, I think, is an invitation to have a conversation with our heart. That's, you know, because I think that, as I said earlier, we're so cerebral. We are surrounded by noise, and writing is this beautiful invitation to listen to our heart. And I guess my question for you is, when you started to allow yourself this expression through your poetry, you were this writer, you were used to journaling, and you encourage people to write letters, as I do too. Just write a letter, get it all out. Even if you're angry, get your anger out, whatever, just get it out. In your poetry, what did you find? What was happening for, because that's a very different kind of writing than journaling poetry. Talk to us about what happened for you in the writing of poetry, in terms of what portal did it open around your ability to release the emotion that you had around your mother's death.
So it would feel almost in a different order, like the portal would open where a thought, an idea, something connected with her. And then the poem would be, I would write it down. I would never work it. I would never change it. It came intact, like, this is what it is. This is what needs to be said. And then after I would write it, then I'd read it. And so it was almost like somebody else was writing it. Like it just came. I wrote it down, and then I would read it as if I was getting some revelation from this poem that somebody else wrote, but it was me. Now, that's some really serious subconscious stuff going on
That's
there.
channeling, right? That's the channeling. And that's what writing can do. It can open that.
Yeah. But I'm channeling something from myself. I'm
Absolutely.
channeling a subconscious thing. And, you know, I don't know. I mean, the first thing that I wrote was actually wrote to her, what would it have been like? And that was a narrative. And then I started, it's July 25th, 1997.
Can you read, of your choosing, can you read something to us?
Sure. And they all, well, in the beginning, it more has to do with the reality of her death, and that this is something, going back to the fact that my parents were surrounded by this group of people that believed that she was going to be healed. And it was almost like this mindset that the physical wasn't important. And that always bothered me. So I'm not speaking very well, but the first one that I wrote was Spirit and Flesh. So it ties in, you know, my Christian faith. So I'm talking about how important flesh is, how important this physical realm is. It's Spirit and Flesh, it's called. Incarnate, in the flesh you came. You knew we needed that. The spirit, the realm of spirit, is hard for us to understand, to touch, to feel, to taste. But you knew, and you know our frame, our temple, fashioned by your hands. It must matter. And if it didn't, you wouldn't have bothered to clothe yourself with our flesh. You have laughed and you have wept in our flesh. So that's not specifically about my mother, but it sets the stage for the fact that she was taken away and cremated. Really bothered me, that I didn't get to see her after she died. That really bothered me. So it was like, poof, she's gone. She was here. poof, she's gone.
I think that you're hitting on something there was actually a documentary about the importance of how the body of our loved one is taken care of after death,
Mm-hmm.
and seeing that body, because there's something about it that allows us to put some sort of closure and to bring our relationship full circle. And I'm saying this to you because I'm going to cry. When my brother died over in Hong Kong,
Mm-hmm.
my parents didn't get to see his body. I saw his body. My older brother saw his body, but nobody else did.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was very difficult. It's exactly what you're talking about, poof. It was very difficult for anyone to wrap their arms around the fact that my brother was gone, because physically he was in Indonesia, right? So we didn't get to see him very often in the flesh anyway. And so now him being gone and knowing, being able to bear witness to that body, it was something that my mother could never quite let go of until the day that she died. And so I feel like we don't talk about this, how important it is. And when my mother died, I was with her. And the people that I talked to at the funeral home said, it is going to be important for you to see your mother,
Mm-hmm.
that the last image of her isn't when she died, that I got to see her. And I didn't realize how important it was until I was able to be with my mother, to talk to her, to put some things in her coffin, and to be able to say goodbye to her. So I really can appreciate what you are saying of being able to have that last moment with your mom.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel like through your writing that these are the things that you're able to not just acknowledge, but you said you feel like that somehow your mother can hear your thoughts, because I believe this too through your writing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I don't want to put words in your mouth. So talk to us around the importance of this. I feel like it's letter writing almost to your
Yes,
mom through your
yes,
poetry.
yes, 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 it is. So what was the question?
I don't really know that I have one other than what this process has done for you in being able to have this dialogue or this relationship with your mother all of these years later that you weren't able to have with her then.
I mean, it's just an incredible thing to me, and I think we know more now about the value of doing this kind of work. It wasn't really, something that someone particularly could have told me about then. But what was so interesting is that there were areas in my life that I was stunted in. And I feel like going through this process, it's like I've caught up to my age. For example, I avoided funerals like the plague. I worked as a vet tech at that time, and when people had to have their animals put down, I either dissociated and just checked out, or I would find somebody else to be there with these people. I just could not cope with the things that I had not come to grips with before I went through this process. And then, so the before and the after were very, very different. It was like I knew me going to a funeral, me being with an animal and the beloved pet owners while the animal was being put down. It wasn't about me. It wasn't about me. I was there for them. And it was like that part of me grew up and was healed just by writing some very simple poems in a book. Yeah.
It's extraordinary because here you are now a chaplain. And one thing, that I'll say is that we cannot hold the space for others' grief if we haven't done our own work.
Exactly.
We just can't.
Exactly.
And it's exactly what you're saying. First of all, we may not know that's what it's about, but it's so uncomfortable. We often, what we think is that it's so painful to be in somebody else's pain because we don't like to see other people hurting. But really, it's about that we haven't done our own work. So therefore we cannot possibly hold this container. It's overwhelming because we haven't dealt
Mm-hmm.
with our own grief.
Mm-hmm.
And when I ran groups at the Center for Grieving Children, we would even say, you cannot come to group until you're able to actually be present for somebody else's grief,
Mm-hmm.
because it's too
Mm-hmm.
much. It's just too much. It's too much for the grieving person.
Right. Right.
And
Right.
now here you are a chaplain, and now you can do that because of your own work. And I would love for you to talk to us about the work that you're doing now in your chaplaincy.
It's so incredible what a gift it is. And it's one of those things where, I've got this degree in pastoral care and counseling, and I've got a coaching business. COVID happens, and I'm like, what am I going to do? I know that there's a reason why I've done all this work, all this schooling, and how is it going to be applicable? And a chaplaincy just really didn't cross the radar for me until there were some jobs on Indeed on my phone that were coming across. And I said, well, that's an interesting idea. Maybe I should think about that. And I applied to the program, not even knowing. It's more or less testing to see if this is something that would make sense for me. And pretty quickly, we are interfacing with patients after we've, done orientation, and everybody's got a background that's applicable. So then, we shadow a chaplain, and then we get to interface with patients and their families. And from day one, I said, if you were to make a list of job traits and put them on a piece of paper and have a checkbox next to them, it would be every check, 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 check. Like everything about it is just, I just feel like I'm where I'm supposed to be. And I was nervous about it because I didn't know, I'd worked in vet medicine for 26 years, but I was never good about people being hurt or injured around me. And I just thought, how's that going to be? I have no idea. And it doesn't seem to be an issue. And, being with families when a loved one is dying, it's such a sacred and moment and such an honor to be privileged to be able to minister to these people. And there's none of that of what it was like for me before I started to resolve the grief surrounding my mother. It's just incredible. It's really hard for me to even explain how extraordinary it is, and so privileged to be able to be allowed into that sacred place or the sharing that people have, from their heart, and just be present with them. It's extraordinary. Yeah, I love it.
Yeah, I mean, as a young social worker, I was a hospice worker, and I've said this numerous times that I don't think and it's not just around death and dying. I don't think that I feel like these interviews are sacred. I feel like when somebody opens their heart to their story and to their pain and to their vulnerability and allow us to bear witness to that, I don't know that there is anything that is more sacred than that. And when I think about animals, animals are all love. Animals don't know how to be anything but pure presence. That's what they are. They're present and they're light. And I would think that the work that you did in veterinary medicine prepared you for where you are now.
Yes, absolutely.
Because to be in a room of not just one person in pain, but to be in a group and holding that container of pain is extraordinary in and of itself. That is a lot of holding, if you will. And you're in the midst of holding that for people that are just haven't even begun to grieve. Because we're in shock when somebody we love dies. I don't think you can prepare for another person's death. We call this anticipatory grief when somebody has cancer or it's a long drawn out death. And so there is this conflict of feeling relief when we've watched somebody in pain die, and also the grief of losing this person, right? So that can be complex in and of itself.
Yeah.
What does it look like for you as a chaplain or ministering to people when they are in the midst of saying goodbye to their loved ones? What does that look like?
What does it look like for me?
For you as a minister, like, are you holding space and being quiet? Are you talking? Like, what are you doing
I think it really depends on the situation. Sometimes, we're called and the family is just so overcome with grief that all you can do is be what we call a non-anxious presence. And just being there and supporting quietly in prayer often. And then there are situations where you have a loved one, that's dying and that they know, they're kind of prepared for that too. And I find people love to tell stories. And of course, honoring the fact that the person is there and that they can very possibly still hear what's going on. So we want to acknowledge that. But for me, it's like I want to get to know this person a little bit, and in the stories that get told, or whatever the person's strengths are, or what they love, or who they loved, and can tell that their hearts just get so full, and they love telling the stories. That alone, that exercise of just sharing, so that I can get an idea of who this person is that I'm going to be praying for, in the presence of the loved ones. It's extraordinary. And it's that, once again, this tremendous privilege. And I even, like, this is still very new for me. I will walk away from a situation like that and I'll just say, thank you that I'm being given a chance to do the thing that I couldn't do with my mother, all those years ago. She's been gone almost 48 years,
Yeah, no, and I can feel it brings up emotion for you even now. And that's the thing about grief, I think, where my brother, we're recording ahead of time, so this won't, this isn't live. So, but the anniversary of his death is tomorrow, Valentine's Day. And it's been 9 years. And I think that anybody, who really knows deep loss, is time doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Like for someone to say 9 years, and I'm like, well, that can't possibly be true, because my brother, I think about every single day. I talk to him every single day. Same with my mother, because when we love, time doesn't mean anything, right? You can sit here and cry about your mother and it doesn't matter, because these people, we have hearts, we love. And just because they're gone doesn't mean that they're with us all the time. They're just with us all the time. And I know that what people struggle with is, how do we support people in pain who are grieving? We don't know what to say. We say things sometimes that are not helpful whatsoever. And we're just trying to do that because we want to alleviate the person's pain. I would love for you to talk to our listeners around some things that they can do when they are trying to support people who are deeply grieving and do not know what to do. They don't know what to say. They don't know what to do. So a couple of things happen. Either they don't say or do anything because they're too afraid of it, or they say too many things like, oh, they're with the angels now, and make people feel even worse. Like, I know. And all of this comes from a beautiful place. We all want to help and support each other. What's some of your sage advice to people who want to support people that are in pain?
Well, and I'm still in process, but I think, from whether it's chaplaincy work or accompanying people who have gone through pain, I think the first thing that comes to me is just being still, slowing down, being physically present. And there is nothing in the world like a really heartfelt hug that lasts a long time. When my dad died 5 years ago and he was 94, I could tell, not to judge people, but the hugs that were healing and the hugs that were just kind of like, oh, this is a hug we do. Very different. I would find just that physical, like my heart to your heart is just, it's extraordinarily powerful. I think just a lot of listening, and not just listening what the person's saying, but listening to yourself, listening to what is resonating with you. How can I be a healing presence for this person and be supportive? And, words just aren't always the best thing in that case,
And I love so much what you just said about the hug, because I always say, let's do a 9-second hug at least. And my little niece, she's 5, and this was at Christmas. And of course she was, coming down from the Christmas thing, and she was crying. And I hugged her and I said, let's talk heart to heart, right? And I just held her. That's all I did. Because I think that what you're talking about is just the essence of our love, of our being. And that's what's most healing, when we can just be. And that's what I was talking about earlier, that if we've not done our own grief work, it can be excruciating to be in the presence of somebody else's pain. So, what would you say to those people who really have a deep discomfort of being in somebody else's pain?
So you're describing, so let's say, for example, you know someone that has lost, say, a brother,
Yeah.
and you have not even begun your work, hypothetically. How could you be present for that person?
Yeah, like I can think being in other people's pain is not an easy thing to do. And I heard this story, this guy had lost his wife and he went back to work and nobody knew what to do. So they avoided him like the plague,
Sure.
which felt like knives going through his heart. So I guess the question is for people who really have a very difficult time supporting people in that way, what else can people do to support the grieving? Do you have any other nuggets of
I,
wisdom?
yeah, I'm not sure other than, what I just said, but I mean, you need to do your own work. We all need to
Yeah.
do our own work. And, whether that means going to, but I think in the beginning, it's just, you're just trying to muddle through anyway. Often grief counseling, it's just, when it's fresh, you really aren't ready. You just need to experience, that grieving process. Someone else's discomfort, I don't know to tell them other than, learning to have compassion if you haven't, worked through it on your own. I don't know that I have pearls of wisdom for you.
I mean, and I guess I'm just asking because, sometimes I'll say to people, if you can't be present, make a meal. If I
Oh,
guess,
there you go. There you go.
I
Something
guess
practical, right?
what I'm getting at is I think what we often will do is say, what can I do for you? And people who
Mm-hmm.
are grieving do not know what, because they don't even know how they're getting through the next day.
Yeah. Well, you don't ask, you just do. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. You don't ask, you just do. You just show up, and you show up in whatever way they can receive. Because if you ask, most people are not going to say, well, I need this, this, and this, because they can't get out of their own way. I mean, it's, yeah. So yeah, you just do it. You just do it. You just show up, you write the letters. I mean, I was listening to one of your podcasts with the two women who one had lost a child and the other one
Yeah.
kept writing her letters.
Yeah.
What a beautiful thing.
Wasn't
But I
that
think that
powerful?
also comes, I mean, that comes from a place of listening. So like you feel this connection, and what can I do? So you listen. What can I do? Well, I could write a letter. Well, then I'm going to write another letter. And so, and the woman who wrote the letters, I think that on some level she was helping herself by doing that,
Abs-
healing herself in some way. Who knows? But I think there's no cookie cutter approach when it comes to this stuff. That's why when I go into a room with a patient or a family or there's someone dying, I don't ever assume that it's going to look like the last one or it's going to look this way. So that's why I think listening to your heart. What I love to talk about, knowing in your knower, that's very much the way that I function in my life in terms of the choices that I make. It's does something feel right? I listen to that inner voice, and usually I will move in that direction. And if it's right, the doors seem to open, and if it's not right, the doors seem to close, and they got to be willing to go another direction if the door closes.
Yeah, I was interviewing this young girl. She was 20 years old when she lost both of her parents. Super, super tragic. But one of the things that she said, I asked her the same question, what helped you? What helped you the most? She told the story of one of her friends gave her a basket full of sunshine, and in that basket were all yellow things, you know,
Mm-hmm.
like
Mm-hmm.
like Butterfingers and a yellow cloth and like dishcloth, but everything was yellow and some of her favorite things because I think there's more people than not that get so uncomfortable in pain. And I think that they want so desperately to do something and don't know what to do. And I love what you just said, knowing, what did you call it? Knowing in your knower? Or say
Hmm.
that again. I just love it so
Yeah.
much.
Knowing and you know her. It's that inner place of knowing, and we all have it. And I think that what happens is that we get our brains get so cluttered and we get so caught up with the busyness of life and what it is that we do that distracts us from paying attention to what's going on inside. But we all have it. We all have that capacity. I believe very strongly that we all have that capacity
A hundred
to
percent.
to hear and to listen. But you have to slow down and not get ahead of yourself, which is hard because we all tend to do that, get ahead of ourselves. Yeah.
Right, because we all have our higher knowing, our soul, our intuition, whatever you want to call it, but we live in such a heady, cerebral space
Mm-hmm.
most of the time, and we're surrounded by noise. And people will hear meditation and they'll be like, I don't meditate, I don't want to meditate. And really the only thing meditation is giving yourself some quiet, because what you're
Mm-hmm.
talking about, you can't know the knower unless you're quiet enough to be able to listen to the, I call it the language of the heart.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
and what I do in my own practice to be present for you for this interview is I rub my heart and I get
Mm-hmm.
myself heart centered,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
because these conversations for me are not what's happening here, but it's what I'm feeling as you're telling me your story. And we all have that wisdom. All of us have it. It's just being quiet enough to be able to hear the voice.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we're at the top of the hour, and I have two questions that I always end with. But before I end with that, is there another piece of poetry that you, because it's my favorite, another, I don't know, just anything, anything.
So this poem is called Ocean Breezes. Salt air breezed reminds me of you. Nostrils flared to take it all in, to every pore. Crashing sound of swollen breakers. You are there with me. I see you on the flats. Hear your voice as seabirds cry. Walk, run, and smash myself against the waves. I think of you and want to share with you some onion rings.
Okay, that is so, I just love it. I wasn't expecting the onion rings. That was so great. The joy in
Yeah.
that. Oh my God, my mother loved onion rings. That is the sweetest thing ever.
Yeah. Yeah.
All
Well,
right, two.
my mother never wanted to share her onion rings, see, so that's why it's funny.
No, and I don't like to share mine either, quite
Yeah.
frankly.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, last two questions. You ready?
Yeah.
What does self-love mean to you?
So it actually goes back to what we were talking about that inner listening, that it's listening to yourself with gentleness. And then what comes of that? It could be quiet, it could be activity, it could be slowing down, engaging more. And I think that this our society thinks that self-love means a day at the spa, which may be that too. But I think that if we all can learn to slow down and listen and honor what comes from that inner self, that's a way of really engaging in self-love.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Finish this sentence. Hope is.
So I think hope is believing that I'm here for a reason and that my job on this earth is to figure out what that is and do whatever I can to fulfill that purpose for my life. And if I do that, if I am engaged in being true to how I am made and who I am, how can I not help but have hope?
Elizabeth, thank you so much for this
Thank you.
beautiful interview.
Thank you.
I want to thank you for sharing your poetry and your
Mm-hmm.
story. And I really hope that if there are listeners out there that have not dealt with grief, their grief, that you have given them some inspiration to start doing just that.
Thank
And you
you.
guys, you don't have to be a writer to start. I call it the exploration into the heart. And we invite you to do that. So, Elizabeth, where can people find you?
Well, my website is innerpathmaker.com,
Yep.
just how it sounds, all lowercase. And my contact information is there. And there's also an ability to send a message right through the website.
And are you taking on individual clients still for coaching? What does that look
Yes,
like?
not as much with the chaplaincy, but I certainly, if anybody has a need, I would make space. And I do expressive arts work as well if anybody's interested in that. Sometimes one just naturally evolves into the other, but often writing is encouraged,
For
a way
that.
to work things out.
All right. Well, I want to thank you. I want to thank all of my listeners. I love you guys. I hope you got a little nugget from today's conversation, and we'll see you guys here next week. Bye for
Thank you,
now.
Susan.